Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another exciting episode of JavaScript Jabber. And this day, I'm supposed to introduce our panel first and then our guest. Steve has corrected me. So we've got me, AJ. I'm your hostess with the mostest, or whatever. And then we got Dan.
Hey.
And we also have Harry Roberts, also known as the infamous CSS Wizardry.
Nothing to do with CSS.
You two. How are you doing?
however.
Well, hello, everyone. Yeah, I don't write any CSS anymore. Also, I picked that domain when I was 17 years old. So that's a cautionary tale for everyone watching. Don't let your children pick their own domain names.
Yeah, parents need to really be on the ball on that one. Especially with the credit cards being like 12-year-olds have credit cards now. I don't know how that happened, but that's a thing.
I haven't seen that. That's terrifying.
Apple has it built into the iPhone. It's like the credit card, you can create a sub-credit anyway. But today's topic is... What are we talking about?
Not child debt.
Child debt, child slavery.
I think today, hopefully, if I'm in the right place, we'll be talking about web performance.
Yeah, web performance.
Not the bottles.
Well, we can have a drink afterwards if we want.
Yeah. No, I'm jealous. You know, it looks like a really nice collection.
All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and... Oops. What?
Oh, no, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, a little bit of audio lag, cross-continental here. Anyway, so let's go ahead and jump right in. And Harry, why don't you tell us why you're famous and your most 3 recent controversial tweets?
Well, I don't think I'm famous. I certainly wouldn't say. I mean, I think if you work in the web performance space, you might have come across my website before. But most controversial tweets. I don't know. I don't really tweet controversial things anymore. Probably the most controversial ever was when imgur.com switched to a single page, fully client rendered app. I don't know if you've noticed, if you look at an X profile now, a Twitter profile, when you're logged out, it doesn't show X's, it doesn't show tweets chronologically, it shows them in the most liked first. So I ended up seeing my own profile logged out, and it reminded me of a tweet from quite a while ago. I really went on Imgur, because they switched to a fully client-rendered SPA to serve up one image. Imgur, honestly, you're probably right. I've never heard it said out loud. I've never tried to say it out loud until just now. But they switched one simple image tag out for about 2.7 meg of JavaScript. And I got flamed for that one. People like, you don't understand the business case of Imgur. They need to serve ads. It's like they can serve ads, but they need to serve the image first. Otherwise, people will stop turning up. So I got flamed for that one. I got flamed for saying people shouldn't use emojis in professional contexts, or GIFs in presentations. One guy wanted to fight me for that one. But I'm not a very controversial person. It doesn't really suit my style and certainly doesn't suit business.
About famous, though, I have to say that I said it before we started recording, and I promise to say it again, that in the particular space of web performance, you, Harry, are one of my tech heroes. And I've been following your content for a long time, your talks, your posts, and I've learned a lot. So, yeah.
Thank you. That really means a lot, especially because, as we were saying just before we started streaming, you and I met years ago. I reckon we must have met 6 to 8 years ago, and we've sort of stayed in touch ever since, but never met again in person, which is a real shame. But that really means a lot, because likewise, I keep an eye on what you're getting up to, and that means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to have you on the show because there are a lot of interesting things going on in the web performance space. And in particular, we are a few months away, literally actually 1 month away, I think now, from Google switching up Core Web Vitals. I mean, they've kind of done it before when they changed the meaning of CLS, cumulative layout shift. They have modified LCP over time a little bit in certain ways, but this is by far the biggest change that they're making. So maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, I mean, swapping the first input delay out and replacing it with INP, I think it's drastic. It's a huge change, and I think a lot of businesses are going to struggle. Speaking purely anecdotally, I have clients who've got 22 million good URLs in Search Console, and in, what is it, the 12th of March, so it's like 1 month and 2 weeks, or whatever it is, these companies are going to have 23 million bad URLs in Search Console. The difference is stark. And one thing I do kind of worry about, and it's not Google's fault at all, but people have known this update was coming for a long, long time. And people are kind of, I've not had a single client who's trying to get ahead of the curve here. I worked with a client only last week who were kind of only just starting to really worry about this. Because I don't think a lot of companies realize just how big the shift is going to be. I think it needed to happen. I think INP is a much more suitable replacement for first input delay, but I do think it may have helped have a bit of a stopgap period, because the difference between the two, as well, is just enormous. And trying to go from FID to INP in one hop is going to be a real struggle for a lot of companies.
So maybe it's worthwhile to set the stage a little bit on that, to maybe talk a little bit about what Core Web Vitals are, what FID was or is, but soon will be deceased, and what INP is that replaces it, to give a little bit of context.
Happily, yeah. So without slides or visual aids, I guess the best way to talk about Core Web Vitals would be, site speed has been a thing for well over a decade now, a long, long time. But historically, we had to lean on archaic and kind of esoteric events like the browser's load event. We talk about load times, but a load time is invisible to a visitor. They don't know what the load event is. You can have a really fast feeling page with a terrible load time, and the load time would be completely irrelevant to what the customer experienced. So Google, to their credit, it's very thoroughly researched, have tried to get some one-size-fits-all metrics that can apply to every site in the world, and try to quantify the user experience of how fast that site felt. The nearest equivalent to a load time would be the largest contentful paint, which is simply when was the biggest bit of content presented on screen. We've got cumulative layout shift, which you already mentioned, which is, did the page move around as it was loading or as you were interacting with it? That's not a performance metric at all. It doesn't measure speed one bit, but it does measure the user experience and sort of measures, was this page frustrating to load? And finally, we had first input delay. And the whole point of first input delay is, in fact, I've got a really good analogy for first input delay and INP, and purely coincidentally, I'm sat in the right place for it. First input delay is when someone clicks a button for the first time on that page, how long did it take before the web application could start responding? And it only measures the first click, and it only measures how long before the application could start responding. So this misses out two... I must have some kind of emojis set up. I don't know what that was. So anyway, that misses two crucial things. The first thing it misses is it only measures the first click on a page. Now, if the first click happens to be really slow, but the next 200 clicks are really fast, you only measure on the really bad one. Conversely, if the first click is really fast and all the next ones are slow, it looks like your page is really quick. The problem with that is it's really easy to game. You could wait for a user to click before booting all your JavaScript. You could say, well, wait for the first click, and that's just going to be a click on anything, and it'll respond really quickly. Then load all your JavaScript. You know that every subsequent click will be slow, but you know it won't get measured. So that's the first problem with first input delay.
To just kind of what Quick is doing, although I don't
let's put that, Quick is an interesting topic, but let's push it off a little bit. I did want to say that in most cases you really didn't need to even game FID that much, because you just got a good FID score almost regardless of what by definition. I said like we kind of that measurement kind of won, in the sense that, if anybody was a laggard, and I worked at Wix, and initially when we started, we were even bad at FID, and then we fixed it, and now Wix has good FID, and that's that. There's nothing more to do in that context. So if you look at most web pages, they just have really good FID, and it's like that. If like have an exam in school, and everybody gets an A or an A plus, then that test is kind of meaningless. It doesn't really provide any information. So we needed to replace FID with something else.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the kind of core problem, was that it was like 99% of websites passed FID, despite we all know that JavaScript is a huge runtime bottleneck. So how could 90 plus websites be passing that metric? The second problem with FID is that it didn't measure how long it actually took to do the work. So the way I explain this to non-technical stakeholders, very non-technical stakeholders, is imagine you went to a bar and you wanted to order a drink. Now, if you get to the bar and the bar's really busy, there are hundreds of people and only one bartender, it's going to take you a long time before you can place your order for your drink. And that's first input delay. It measures your first order for your first drink, and it only measures how long it took you to order the drink. So it doesn't matter how quick the bartender is or how long it took them to get the drink to you. That doesn't get counted. Whereas interacting to next paint, the analogy would be, you might go to a really, really busy bar, and you might order a drink, and it might take you a long time to order that drink because there are so many other customers there. But if you just order a glass of water or a bottle of beer, then the bartender can produce that drink very, very quickly. If you order a really complicated cocktail, then the processing time of that drink will be increased. If you just stay at the bar and they slide it over the bar to you and you take the drink, that's your presentation delay, and they can get the drink to you very quickly. However, if you say, oh, I'm going to go and sit over in the corner, and the bartender has to now bring the drink over to you, that's your presentation delay. So what INP does is it doesn't just measure how long it takes to order your drink, it measures how long it took to make your drink and how long it took for the bartender to put the drink in your hand. And it does that for every drink you order, not just the first drink. So I feel like first input delay was really easy to game for those two reasons. It was only the first click, and it only measured the delay to start the work. INP is much harder to pass because it measures between 98th and 100th percentile, so more or less your very worst clicks. And it's not even clicks, it's interactions, so key presses and stuff like that. And then how long it took to process that and how long it took to display that to you. It measures a lot more work, and that's why most sites are going to go from green to red overnight.
A few more thoughts, both about FID and INP. So from the get-go, I had issues, let's say, with FID. And I was very upfront with the people, with the great, excellent people at Google about it. Annie Sullivan, Michael, Yoav Weiss while he was there, and others, Patrick. And the problem is that in many cases, if your website was especially slow in loading, you actually got better FID. Because if your JavaScript took a long time to download, so long, in fact, that the user interacted with the page before the JavaScript actually even loaded, then on the other hand, the page had, let's say, SSR or SSG, so the content was actually already visible, then you would click a button that would literally do nothing because the JavaScript wasn't even wired up yet. And from the FID's perspective, it would be instantly responsive. The response would be effectively nothing, but your FID would be excellent. And that was one of the issues that we had at Wix, that initially when we started to improve the download speed of the delivery of the JavaScript, we actually had hit this kind of valley where it seemed to be getting initially worse before it started getting better, simply because the pages were getting interactive sooner, and that problem I just described was less likely to happen. But go for it. Sorry.
I've run into the exact same thing on client sites. Clients very aggressively deferring their JavaScript would end up passing FID purely because even clicking a native browser input like a button, you don't have to wait for the JavaScript event handlers to be attached. Browsers have their own event handlers attached to buttons already. So exactly as you say, if someone interacts with an interactive element before the JavaScript is booted, it will still capture a valid input. Even that input doesn't do anything. Because here's the other thing, first input delay and INP, just INP. Even if there isn't a UI update afterwards, even if there isn't a next paint, you still capture a score for every click. So what that means is, in the case of FID, the button doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to do anything at all. FID only captures the fact that you clicked a button, and if it needed to do something, we could have done it immediately. So exactly as you say, a big risk was people really, really aggressively deferring and late loading their JavaScript could sort of skirt around the system purely because the chance of someone clicking before the JavaScript had run was actually quite high.
Now, you talked about the fact that you're seeing customers, and maybe it's worthwhile to mention that you work as a freelance consultant and you work with customers organizations looking to improve their performance of the websites. So you're obviously exposed to a lot of poor performing websites. And
A lot.
yeah, you mentioned that you're seeing scenarios where they currently have really good FID and even LCP and CLS, and consequently are really passing Core Web Vitals on most of their pages for example, in the Google Search Console. But that once they switch over to INP, that the situation will be much worse. Now, it's interesting because I brought up this concern with the people from Google a while back. I don't remember if it was with Annie or with Rick or with Michael, one of them. And their response was that according to their tests, what they saw was that most organizations that have a poor INP or will have poor INP also already have poor LCP. So their argument was that the overall ratio of passing websites won't change that much because the score for like you said, the score for that interactivity, the interactivity score will drop, but it will have a lesser impact on the overall cumulative score of all three Core Web Vitals. Would you agree with that or not? Based on your personal experience.
Yes, I haven't seen things that necessarily corroborate that. And do you know what? I really don't have the access to the data they do. So I look at a small enough number of data sets that no two look alike, and every single site seems to have unrelated issues. So,
really?
I see sites that, yeah. So I've got a client at the moment who doing really well in LCP, really bad in CLS and INP. Their LCP is great; it's been great forever. I don't typically tend to see patterns, but I'm looking at a really small scale. So I'm not talking HTTP archive. I'm not talking, Google's Crux database at large. Anecdotally, on my own clients, I can't really decipher or see any patterns that suggest that the phones are going to bucket.
I have to say that kind of surprises me to an extent, because I would expect for you to be seeing the same issues over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's really surprising. Some issues are really common, but we've had, I think the performance industry and people who care about performance even a little bit are wise to the fact that some things are always will always cause you problems. Client-side rendering is a terrible idea if you want to be fast. Certain things are just starting to get filtered out, and those same mistakes that I would see 5 years ago are far less common. Now what I'm seeing on a per project basis is every client has pretty significantly different problems to the last.
So, that kind of moves us over to the next part of the conversation, I guess, because when we were talking about, what we should discuss on this podcast, I thought that an excellent topic would be to talk about, what you are encountering in various customer sites. Obviously, without naming names, unless you really want to. but
probably,
basically things like on the practical side, things that you tend to see and mistakes that people tend to make, but also amusing stories if you can share them.
Yeah. Well, like I said before, it used to be 5 years ago, everyone had gone full client-side React, and that's always going to be slow. And then everyone now knows that server-side rendered and then rehydration is faster. Not perfect, but certainly faster. So a lot of the age-old problems seem to be filtered out. I don't know how, but it was a tweet of mine that was responsible for a lighthouse check for, are you lazy loading your LTP image? Because that was so commonplace. Even before WordPress plugins enabled that by accident. All these really common problems, I think even just non-performance engineers are now so aware of web performance that basic mistakes, certainly on the projects I'm seeing, don't really get made so much anymore. So I keep running into things where...
If I can interject for one thing, you mentioned client-side rendered React. Basically websites or projects that initially started with a Create React app
Yes.
have essentially, by definition, will have poor core performance as is measured by Core Vitals. And that's not surprising because obviously, if you need to download a ton of JavaScript, then run that JavaScript, make several AJAX requests, run more JavaScript, and only then actually start showing stuff, then obviously that's going to be much slower than a website that just downloads stuff from the get-go. But the interesting thing is that when speaking with various, let's call them larger companies that build, let's call them quote unquote web applications, a lot of them still work this way. If the web app is not SEO'd, if it's if it's something that's behind a login screen or whatever, then from their perspective, it's okay to work this way. So I'm kind of seeing the market splitting on this regard. Like some sites care about load performance, and a lot of sites really don't.
Yeah, and I do agree with that sentiment. So, for example, my accountancy software is all web-based, and it's slow. But if I log into my accountancy software, I have to do it. And I know it's going to take me at least 30 minutes anyway, but I don't mind it being slow as long as once it's there, it's usable. And the sensitivity there is a lot less than if I just want to find out, if I just want to quickly buy some groceries on the way home or something really quick, I just want to buy something quickly and leave again, there's a lot more friction, a lot more sensitivity. If the task itself should be a 2-minute task, you don't want to spend 10% of that time just waiting. Whereas if the task's a 30-minute task, you don't mind the upfront cost. I don't have any research to prove this, but I do sympathize with the use case of we're a web app. I'd be happy to wait for Photoshop in the browser. I wouldn't be happy to wait the same amount of time to work out what time my next train is. There is no way of quantifying that sensitivity, but I do believe it exists. And I do think that there's no definition between what's a web app and what's a web site. One thing I do think is if you're a company who can name 5 different pages on your website, we've got the homepage, a product details page, a product listing page, a search page. If you've just listed 4 different pages, you're not a single page app. So don't build a single page app. Build a multiple page app. If you can name pages, you aren't a single page app. Trello is a single page app. Google Sheets is a single page app. Your e-com site is not a single page app because you've got your homepage, your category page, your product listing page, your product details page. You've got your FAQs page. They're all different pages. So
what is
don't
Twitter?
build a single page app. A mess. Twitter is...
But I mean, like Twitter and Facebook, right? Would you say that the feed is one app? And then, because it seems like the in-between is, don't try to build a single page app where you literally build everything that you do in a single application. I agree. That's beyond silly, except that, that's what's been done the last 10 years. And there's no sense in, if you have a lot of interactive stuff, doing server reloads for every single interaction. But like, there is some sort of delineation. Like your feed is a single page app, your account settings is a single page app, but your feed and your account settings are not the same app. Is it? I mean,
so if I can touch on that. So we've had Alex Russell on the podcast actually twice, and I think we had him almost a year ago the last time. And the distinction that he kind of makes is based on the amount of interactions. Like, is it something that you like click? Like, are you clicking a few times to maybe a few dozen times, or are you going to be clicking hundreds of times? Now, I don't remember exactly where Alex draws the line. I know that he's done a bunch of research on this topic. You can check his website, which is slightly late, I think. Is no, that's his handle. I always forget his.
Infrequently noted.
Yeah, infrequently noted. So you can check his. Yeah, he's funny like that. So, anyway, so he's done research on this topic, and that's the delineation that he makes, and I kind of concur with that.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know where the cutoff point is, and I agree with him. But the way I've always worded, I've never heard him say that, but I agree with him. The way I've always described it to my clients is, how big is the feedback loop? If you've got Photoshop in the browser, you don't want to wait a full round trip before you notice the pixels turning green. If you've got Google Sheets, you don't want to notice a full round trip of latency before cell A and cell B get summed together. So if your feedback loop, where you expect feedback, is instant, then that is what I would consider more app-like. If read and write are almost one-to-one. Whereas if you look at an e-commerce site or buying, just look at an e-commerce site or a news website, you don't have feedback loops. You spend most time consuming, especially on a news website, you scroll, you read, you scroll, you read. That didn't ought to be a single page app. If you were flicking through an article every half a second, which you wouldn't ever be doing, but it's not until you're doing really frequent and you need that feedback loop to be super tight that you need to build things in the browser. So I think for the most common use cases, e-com, publishing, certainly publishing, a single page app is not the right process. Now, your checkout flow, that might be a single page app because it might be a case of, like, as you say, it's behind a login. It's not indexed anyway. By the time someone's got into the checkout process, they are statistically less sensitive. Studies have shown that once people have committed to buying something, they are more likely to stick with it. So they're less sensitive to site speed there. Your checkout flow, that could be an SPA. That's absolutely fine because by and large, every page is the same, just different form details, your address, your billing details, discount code, etc. That's where your feedback loop is. Okay, I've got my credit card in my hand and I'm going to do that. So I think Alex says interactions. I think I'm saying the exact same thing, which is nice because Alex is very smart. But I always describe to clients as, where do you want that feedback loop? Trello, you want to drag a card from one column to another and see it land there instantaneously. If you're clicking a related product, that's another page. And that feels like the feedback loop doesn't need to be anywhere near as instant as dragging a card from one column to another.
So going back to the topic of the issues that you encounter as a consultant coming in on, I assume, mostly to assist with projects where performance is an issue. What are common problems that you encounter, and what are amusing problems that you encounter?
Really common problems are things like fetishization of things like microservices, micro front ends, composable commerce, and single page apps. They're really common. So nearly every site I look at, you're a single page app, you're struggling with performance, maybe not because of your own fault, but because you weren't aware that Core Web Vitals doesn't play very nicely with single page apps, at present at least. So I've got loads of clients at the moment who their sites are pretty fast from a cold start, but the fact they're an SPA means a lot of that data gets lost. So they appear a lot slower than they are. One thing I keep coming across is, and 2 projects in a row now, is composable commerce. And it's like, right, we've got to make API calls to X different third parties. That's all latency that all just goes into time first byte. Parallelize as much of it as you can, but you're still kind of, for the most part, only as fast as the slowest response. Then you move to like your server your client rendered, so the app rehydrates, and you move into the client rendered version, the rehydrated version. All those API calls now happen on the client side, and I've seen this in 2 projects in a row. Everyone loves to have api.company.com on a different domain, which means it's immediately a cross-origin request, which means immediately you've got pre-flight requests. So 2 projects in a row. Never really noticed it before, but full round trips of latency in band on every request to the API endpoint because they weren't caching their pre-flight requests. These are rare things I see they don't amuse me, but I feel like you designed this problem for yourselves. if you just had company.com/API, get rid of all those problems. But because everyone loves to have api.company.com, you now enforce pre-flight requests.
Hold on. I want to push back on that. So can you think of a reason why people are doing that? Because I know of some reasons why it's beneficial, but like, are you just dismissing it wholesale, or do you think that people don't actually have the problems? And what do you understand what the impetus for the API was other than cuteness? Because I don't think it's just cuteness, although I'm sure that plays a part.
I don't think it's just cuteness, and I don't have like a list of answers as to why, but architectural simplification, like a lot of companies just hang things off domains so they can share them internally a lot easier. They can deploy it as their own sort of architecture and its own kind of, I don't know, its own standalone product. But yeah, I just feel like a lot of problems like that would be the performance problems it brings. It'd be like if we could just stick this on /API/
and
you remove a lot of issues.
And using resources like pre-connect or something like that doesn't mostly resolve that problem. I mean, you're going to be waiting for the JavaScript to download in most cases anyway before making those API calls. So you could at least use that JavaScript download time to pre-connect to that API endpoint.
So pre-connect wouldn't work because pre-connect will open a cause. You can open a cause-enabled connection, but you don't explain why you need it. So what a pre-flight does is it says, "Oh, you've got a request header that we don't like that. You can't hit us with that request header."
Do you actually get cores on subdomains? I forget.
You do.
Yes. Yeah, it's cross-origin, and a subdomain is a new origin. So I've got a client at the moment, and if they just move from company.com if they move from API dot to /API, they would remove all the cause issues because cross-origin, a subdomain, and a different subdomain, a different port would put you in that cross-origin category.
Oh, so it's also a different port.
No, it's either.
It's either. Okay.
Yeah, which that you come into issues with localhost on that all the time, which is one of the reasons I tell people not to develop on localhost, like use a domain or whatever. But so for that, I think that in the modern era, I think that the reasons that we did API dot whatever don't hold as much water as they used to. One of the reasons had to do with cookie policies, and all browsers that are out there today, other than your Xbox and your Wii, have browser, and those you're not as worried about, like clickjacking and cross origin forgery of a bank website on those, legacy systems that people still use all the time but are never going to get updated. But all of the browsers that you have on phones and on desktops where you're likely to do work, the cookie settings are now such that you can set a few flags like HTTPS only, server side only, strict origin policy, a few things like that. And you can get all the benefits that you would have gotten by having your APIs go through a separate domain where you didn't necessarily want to mix up the chance that your authentication middleware would be allowing cross-site requests via API and accidentally get authenticated with a cookie when they shouldn't have been.
So AJ, you're absolutely right. I've not really thought about it like this. You've made me realize the whole point of using API dot is you're opting into cause-enabled requests. You're opting into cause. You want cause to stop things leaking. But now we've got other ways around that. I guess we don't need it. So I guess the whole point people did use API dot was like, no, cause is a benefit for us. It's a feature. We want to strict credentials. We want to make sure we don't leak anything. So that's why if we put it on API dot, we get all that for free. Yeah, it's a performance hit, but so you're absolutely right. I guess the simplest answer is cause is a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. So, but I agree. I believe that you can get all of the same security features today and be reasonably assured that if somebody hasn't updated their browser for the last year or two, which is most people, that they still have that in their browser. Like it's been part of browsers long enough that I think I'm pretty sure that it's safe to do. But I mean, my advice would be if you're going to tell somebody to switch over from API to /API/, that's great as long as the security concerns follow. that
Oh yeah,
those
absolutely. I
options
wouldn't
get
just say
enabled.
it'll find and replace. Yeah.
You just said something that really amused me, AJ, about not updating your browser, because whenever I go on my wife's computer for some reason and I open up the browser and I see that red button saying, "You must update now," I'm like, ah, how did you not update?
My wife probably updates her browser about as frequently as she updates her operating system, which is when I sit down at it, I can tell that there's nothing that she's immediately using for something that can't be restarted from, and I restart the computer. So about twice a year, when she asks me to do something on her computer, her browser gets updated. And that's because
Yeah.
she has a techie husband.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I think, or rather, I think it's really easy for people like us who are very tech fluent and who are surrounded by it every day. It's second nature to us. But people aren't in tech. Why do I need to update it? It works. It works.
so
I don't care if
basically
I've
you're
got request
yeah.
idle callback in iOS 17. I don't care.
So basically, you're
No.
saying that the fact that Windows 95, I think, like couldn't run for more than 39 days straight without a restart was a feature rather than a bug.
That, I mean, we give Microsoft a lot of crap for the, your computer is restarting in 60 seconds, but they're not, I mean, they are servicing people who are non-professionals and who are, they're servicing the lay people. Like the average
And
person
on a
shopping
scale
at
we can't
Walmart
even
gets
fathom.
Windows. So the average Mac user is someone who is they're in a different tier of work or a different tier of economics than the average Windows user.
Although
So
you'll be surprised, like I know, like I don't want to, say anything bad about, designers, but I have seen some that like were kind of unaware about tech. But tell me, like Harry, don't you want come into a project feeling all good about telling them how they should optimize this or optimize that, and then run into like a 12 megabyte GIF that they're downloading, in their homepage or something like that?
Yeah, luckily that's less frequent, and that's almost always a CMS issue. Like, oh, a CMS user uploaded that. So yeah, I like when I find really impactful or interesting or exciting things to tell people, but part of my standard process is let's look for anything silly. I take waterfall charts and I organize them by largest to smallest resource. And I once found a 1.2 megabyte fav icon. And that's because the designer who was asked to export the fav icon took the entire sprite sheet. It was back when people used Sketch. And it was the entire icon set for the entire website. And they couldn't be bothered exporting the favicon, so they just set the bounding box to cover the favicon they needed. And the favicon.ico ended up being this enormous bank of data, every icon for the site, and it had a bounding rectangle around the one they needed. They exported that, but it contained all the data for all the others. Is that right? You've got a 1.2 megabyte favicon after gzip. It was unwieldy. So, well, there's your problem. Like, just go and sort that out. That's really low hanging fruit.
Yeah. By the way, one thing that I've also encountered in many cases, like, when websites, especially created by designers, is that they construct the images. So, like, you have something which is an image, which should have been, let's say, well, I'll call it a JPEG, but a lossy compressed image. But they've actually, because they use some sort of software for actually doing it, and they worked in layers. They actually
Yeah.
create multiple layers, and then they need the transparency because they're now layering them one on top of the other, so they're all PNGs. So what could have been one JPEG ends up being comprised of like 5 PNGs.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen back when I used to do a lot of very front end work, kind of slicing other people's Photoshop files. My biggest gripe when people make flat looking UI. Like when I say flat UI, I don't mean the design style. I mean, something looks like it could be a flattened single image, just a raster image exported as a JPEG, not even with any transparency. But the way they made the image is by layering things up in Photoshop with loads of different blend modes. So I'd have to like isolate it, flatten it myself, make it transparent, put a background on it, and then it was all just nightmarish. Stuff like that, designers then, and I say designers, front-end developers, people, our colleagues, might use sort of blend modes in the browser to kind of achieve the effect. But then that just has runtime overhead. That can get really sluggish on very heavy pages when you've got images and elements interacting with each other and the kind of intersection of their blend modes. So yeah, that's not the stuff I tend to run into very often because I don't get to work on I love my clients so much. I love you all very much, but I don't get to work on very creative projects. Normally it's just a case of, here's our asset library of every product we sell, and that's it. I guess if you look at Wix, you'll see things that are much more creative.
Well, one of the more creative pages that I saw at Wix, it was actually an internal website built. So Wix does a lot of dog fooding. All the Wix stuff is actually built on Wix, or as much as possible. And certainly all the marketing pages that Wix uses are built on Wix. And I was asked to look at one of those marketing pages back in the day, and they talking about waterfalls. In this case, it was literally an image of a waterfall. So they created a beautiful page that had this waterfall running down the entire page. And it was built as one image that was 10 screens long. So, so I basically told them, let's split this image up and lazy load the rest, or something along these lines. So,
do you want to hear a really creative thing that I saw? Somebody gaming LCP. So if you look at,
but that wasn't intended to game. That really destroyed LCP because of the huge image that
the sheer size. Oh, I know. You just reminded me of a funny story about you broke an image into smaller pieces. So I had a client, and if everyone who's watching just looks at like my little rectangle that I'm in here, that's your LCP. Let's say that's your LCP image on your homepage. This client was struggling to get it fast enough because the image, it was quite detailed. They were struggling to optimize it enough that it looked nice, but was still fast, even if they were preloading, whatever. So all they did was they sliced it into 4 images and then put them right next to each other. And the image loaded like in a random order, but it was about 4 times faster because the image, each file was about a quarter of the size. So whichever one of those 4 images arrived first was the LCP, then the subsequent 3 were ignored. And it was a horrible loading experience. So you'd see this image go, and it would be at random. So sometimes the second image would be first, or the third one would be first.
It is worth noting, by the way, that in the discussions of the W3C Web Performance Working Group, one of the items that keeps coming up is how to deal with images that get progressively rendered. Like when should you measure? When is the LCP? When should the LCP be measured for progressively enhanced images? And it's one of those cases. It's kind of hard to say.
Well,
that's a pretty big topic. AJ was going to say something before we move on.
Yeah, do you know why that happens? That splitting it up into 4 made it load faster?
The browser can prioritize one of them above the others, so it'll prioritize. It'll see whichever it can give a higher priority to one of them.
The compression algorithm is based on pixel width. So if you, depending on how you vary the pixel width when it analyzes the image, it compresses differently. So sometimes just randomly resizing an image, you'll get better compression because you happen to hit one of the default boundaries it will try. There is a tool that you can use. Have you heard of Image Optim?
Yeah.
So Image Optim will basically brute force every possible dictionary size in the compression algorithm and find which dictionary size happens to be the best one. And on an M2 Max, it will take a couple of minutes for a relatively small image file. So it really does brute force every combination that it can, but it will reduce the file sizes much, much smaller than probably any other program that other than
But
someone that's a clone of it.
I
in
did not know that. I thought you were talking from a browser's perspective, how would it work? And I was like, oh, each
I'm
image is a quarter
thinking,
of the size. But I didn't know it
exactly.
was in the algorithm for the image
By the
itself.
way, in that context, I'd highly recommend watching that talk from the Performance Now conference. Who was it that gave it? I need to find it, about how HTTP2 downloads multiple resources in parallel. The prioritization. They talk about prioritization. You know which talk I'm talking about?
Was it from
I wanna see this one.
2023?
Yes.
It was Robin Marks. He was talking about
Yes,
resource
exactly.
loading at the cutting edge. It was incredible. It was
Yeah.
it was the exact kind of content I live for. It was really, really good. Robin Marks, resource loading at the cutting edge.
Yeah, it's an incredible talk because he talks exactly about that kind of a scenario where you're using the HTTP2 to download to download these 4 images effectively in parallel, and it depending on the browser and on the CDN and on the server, it might download faster or it might download slower, and it really kind of depends.
Yeah, because the
But
risk is if you download all 4 images in parallel, you just slow all 4 of them down. But if your browser and server are talking the same kind of prioritization language, it'll do image 1, 2, 3, and then 4 in order. And that's how you can game LCP, is because you can be fairly certain that instead of all 4 images arriving at the same time, you get 1, then 2, then 3, then 4.
And we must say that please don't game the metrics because you're doing more harm. You're doing more harm than good. At the end of the day, the metrics, Google might care a little bit about the metrics, but the ones who really care a lot are your visitors, and they don't care about because the score. They care because of their experience. And if their experience is shitty, then they will leave, and then you'll
I've
get
got
high
a client
bounce
right
rate.
now. I had this discussion today, and it made me realize something really interesting about LCP as a metric. I've been saying this for quite a long time, and I know my friend Andy Davies has been saying this for a long, long time. Largest isn't always the most important bit of content. If you go to the Lufthansa website or you go to the British Airways website, the biggest bit of content is a picture of an airplane. Most important bit of content is the form inside of it. So you need in certain scenarios like that, I tell clients you need custom metrics as well. Use the element timing API. We don't care how soon a user could see that picture of an airplane. We care how quickly they could see the form for booking a flight. So I've got a client at the moment. They have their LTP site-wide is, I think it was 2.6 seconds. As far as core vitals is concerned, we only need to find 100 milliseconds. But they read a study somewhere that said somebody else improved LTP by 1 second and made 10% more money. So they want to get their LTP down to 1.6 seconds. It's going to be really difficult for this website because they hit a lot of third-party domains to build the page. A lot of the pages are still client rendered, so it's going to be really difficult for them to hit 1.6 seconds. So what I said to them, kind of as a joke, was, I know what we could do. Why don't we redesign? It's an e-commerce website. I was like, why don't we redesign all the product pages so that the heading is the biggest bit of content and the image is really small? Then you'll have a really good LTP because text is fast and images are slow. And they're like, no, we can't do that because we need people to see the image. I was like, so do you care about the metric or do you care about the customer experience? What we need to measure is then I said to them, you don't care about the largest bit of content. Your image just happens to be the largest. What we need to measure is how soon someone could see the image. If you just want to get a 1.6 LTP, just to say you've got a 1.6 LTP, we'll just make sure your LTP is an H1 and not an image. No, no, we can't do that. We can't do that.
So funnily enough, I was working on a page where the hero image was only really slightly larger than the title text. So I said, if we make the text just a little bit bigger or the image just a little bit smaller. Yeah.
Well, but it's interesting because the LTP, I've read the LTP spec inside out because I wrote an article about how to, because it comes back, actually, this brings us nicely down back to progressive images. But the LTP algorithm also uses intersection observer to see how much of the element is in view. So I've got certain clients where if the mobile phone screen is short enough, the hero image is majority off screen, so it is the H1. But someone on a higher resolution or slightly longer, if someone's on an iPhone Max, then the image well, not on an iPhone, obviously, because we don't capture iOS data. If someone's on a big phone, the image is far enough in viewport that it becomes LTP. So the exact same page on different mobile devices is really difficult. So that's why when you look at PageSpeed Insights or Crux and it just says desktop and mobile, it's really important to remember that inside of desktop and mobile, there are also a lot of varieties. What I'll find is I don't like Lighthouse as a tool for me professionally. It's too simple, it's too basic, but clients love it. Web page test, their mobile device screen sizes are smaller than Lighthouse.
Yeah, it's
I'll
a
have
Moto
clients who will,
G1.
yes, I'll
It's a
have
Moto
clients who run a
G4,
Lighthouse
sorry.
test. Yeah, I'll have
Yeah.
clients who run a Lighthouse test, and it'll come up with a different LTP to the web page test that I'm running. So there's loads of disparity there. But I read the spec inside out, and the first thing it does, or one of the first things it does, is it calculates how much is even on screen. Because if the image is bigger than the H1, but the image is majority off screen, like you say, then we just don't count what we can't see. And that brings us on to the progressive images thing, which I think it's been a frustration for years. There is no, even though the customer experience is better, there is no benefit to performance scoring for using a progressive JPEG, which I just think is unfair, or any progressive format.
Yeah, I agree.
Wait, but why would you want to use a progressive JPEG?
Because you get content, you get potentially meaningful content on the screen faster.
Do you really? Because I remember progressive JPEGs, and they just kind of sucked.
So you'd probably want to build them yourself. So they contain scans, and you can pass in a scan file to you batch process your images or do it all in bulk, whatever. But what can end up happening is the progressive JPEG embeds like 8 versions of itself. And the first ones will look really disgusting. And that's not a good customer experience. So you're probably going to build a scan file that says, just build me 3 scans, like medium, high, very high quality, and do it that way. So you avoid the really, really low quality end of progressive JPEGs and just opt into like medium, high, and super high res. That's what I tend to do.
I think I could buy into that if there was a way for the high DPI displays to know to pick for it to just not bother loading the super high res one unless it's high DPI.
Well, you can with the image tag, with the picture tag, or the image tag. Even these days, you can specify images to be associated with the device's DPI. The browser is smart enough.
So then why wouldn't I just use the picture tag and use multiple JPEGs rather than a progressive JPEG? But then
because each one of those
complicated.
But yeah, each one of those multiple JPEGs would have multiple JPEGs inside it. So for every use case, you could potentially, for every one of them, have a slightly faster LTP. Progressive images, I think, serve a real benefit.
I'll give another scenario.
It shows some visual feedback.
I'll give another scenario. Another thing that I encountered at Wix a lot are people building their website, let's say, with white background, a dark background image, and white text. And then what would happen is that until the dark image would actually load, the text would be white on white. So the text would be there, you just couldn't see it. So at a certain point in time, we actually would have like image placeholders, kind of like what you get in YouTube style thing, or I think Medium kind of were the first
sort of introduced that.
Yeah, to introduce that, just so that you would get the feeling that how the page should look like and see that text faster than otherwise. But I do have a question before we're running long, and there are a few questions that I did want to get to talk about, because I assume that with at least some of your customers, you're running into scenarios where let's say you've got poor INP, but looking at the site, it's because they have a lot of, let's say, third-party scripts or pixels. And then you say, well, you want to improve INP, get rid of your pixels or get rid of half your pixels, and say, we can't. We need them for our marketing campaigns. Or alternatively, their score is poor because they're using like some sort of a heavy framework, client-side rendered, whatnot. Like, what are you going to tell them? Rebuild re-architect your entire solution? Like, what do you do in those scenarios?
It's difficult. It's really difficult to advise because the answers are very complex. And one thing I find really interesting is if you read anything on web.dev, the advice is always the same: break up your long tasks. It's like, well, how? Step by step, how does one break up a long task? Because if I've got a function, and JavaScript runs like run to completion, so a function can't be interrupted or paused halfway through, it has to finish. So if you've got a click handler that has to do X amount of work, telling someone to break that up is really difficult because, well, when do I do it? So what I try and tell clients is it's just going to be really difficult. It's going to be hard to do. But I was with a client last week. The biggest culprit of theirs was they did loads of synchronous Google Tag Manager stuff on every click. They track everything. Someone clicks the menu open, it gets tracked. They close it again, it gets tracked. They click in the search field, it gets tracked. They don't type anything, that gets tracked. And all of that is like, that measures like, okay, 10% of people who clicked in the search box never typed anything. So why didn't they type? So it's valuable business data, but it all happens synchronously. So for them, one of the biggest things, and like you say, it's a third-party tag manager, is just fulfill the user need immediately and sling all of that tracking work into like a set timeout or request idle callback or soon it'll be scheduler.yield. So it's look for the obvious things first. Look for the obvious things like, okay, tracking, move that into the next task. When you still end up with a task that's really large and you can't break it down any further, it's really hard to work out what to. If you've got a function that needs to necessarily do quite a lot of heavy lifting, that's when you start to get into trouble. And I will admit, I'll be the first person to admit on a JavaScript podcast, I'm not a very proficient hardcore JavaScript developer. I never have been. So when it comes to breaking up long tasks, all I can really tell clients is I can show you the tooling. We can look at what it's doing, but you need to decide like which of this thing needs to happen immediately, which of this needs to happen for the user, and what can you do safely elsewhere. So like Party Town, if you've got really egregious tags,
that's actually what we ended up doing at Next Insurance, where I currently work. So we had like not terrible, but kind of mediocre INP, but we were really anxious about having good core vitals across the board, even when INP lands. So we introduced Party Town, and the improvement was dramatic. So now we really have excellent INP. But aside from maybe third-party scripts, like I'm really surprised when people have really long tasks. I mean, unless you're building a really sophisticated web application that does something, like super heavy, in which case, that kind of brings us back to the web applications where these issues are kind of different, then I'm really surprised at having really long tasks. Like, what are you doing? Like computing pi to the millionth digit? What's all this computation about?
Do you know what? Anyone listening, I am for hire, and INP kicks in on the 12th of March. So get in touch. But I've got a full section of my workshop that starts out with, we always blame JavaScript. And JavaScript is yellow in DevTools. It's a big yellow slide. We always blame JavaScript. And the next slide is purple for layout and recalc style. But it's usually going to be a CSS. With INP, what you'll find happening all the time is there'll be some synchronous layout thrashing. So the JavaScript overhead might be quite minimal. But someone's getting, I had a client where they had a list of 250 product images. And they wanted to line the image widths up with the image, with an element outside of that. Instead of getting the width of the element outside and then applying that width to 250 images, they got a node list of the images, then for each went, how big's the image? Make it that big. How big's the image? And they did that all synchronously. It took 5 seconds.
Layout thrashing.
Severe layout thrashing. So oftentimes what I find and what I try and tell clients and developers that I'm training, everyone's quick to blame JavaScript, but seriously, go and look for your purple. And then purple is going to be either recalc style or it's going to be layout. Are they in the right order as you're looking at them? Recalc style, layout. If you've got long recalc styles and short layout, that is because you've got complex CSS selectors, or you've got a lot of CSS, or you've got a lot of HTML. If you've got a long layout task, that's going to be structurally the page is quite complex to lay out. You might have a lot of overlapping things. You might have a lot of grid or flexbox that relies on each other. So very heavy, how to describe it? Pages that look like tables of data but aren't, that are built using things like flexbox. Generally, you want to simplify the layout of the page there. Make sure you don't add things to the DOM that nudge the DOM wider. So a lot of the time, long tasks are going to be CSS-y, recalc style and layout. If recalc style is your cost, go and look at your cost of your CSS selectors, the amount of CSS or the size of the CSS object model, and the DOM. If it's layout, try and simplify the page. Or
yeah, 2 points I'd like to mention. So in the context of, we talked about layout thrashing. One of the things to take into account is forced reflows. It's like you kind of mentioned it. It's, a quick explanation. When you modify the DOM inside JavaScript, then in most cases the browser will try to not relay out the page until it absolutely has to. So basically, it will try to run all the JavaScript, and only then, when the JavaScript is done, actually apply the layout changes that result from the DOM changes you've made. But if you kind of ask the browser, the DOM, about, let's say, the size or position of an element, you're kind of forcing it. You're forcing its hand. You're telling it you must apply all the changes that you've done in order to be able to answer that question. That's called a forced reflow. And layout thrashing is when you set something, ask something, set something, ask something, and you're forcing the browser to reflow, like on every iteration of the loop, as it were. So in that case, it's beneficial to break it into even two loops, like do all the sets and then do all the gets, or something, or do all the gets and then do all the sets, whatever, but don't interleave the gets and the sets together. And I had a similar situation, but we don't have time to go into the details. You kind of described it. The other thing I'd like to mention is the CSS content visibility setting, which you can, if you have a super complex page, you can at least say, well, all these areas that are below the fold, don't try to lay them out now because nobody sees them. And if you know that they can't impact what the user is actually saying, then that can really speed up that sort of thing.
Yeah. I've got it's a nasty CSS selector, but I used it I profiled it, and it turns out even the nasty CSS selector is faster than the cost of laying out long blog posts. I've got certain articles on my site that are tens of thousands of words, really, really long. Most users aren't going to scroll all the way to the bottom, so most people aren't going to see everything. So I've got a selector which is main content space H2 tilde H2. So any H2 anywhere after the second H2, or you could do H2 nth of type 2. Everything after the second H2, content visibility auto. So everything after the second H2, so like you've got an H1, an H2 here, maybe an H2 here, that's going to be pretty far down the article already. By the time you're at the second H2, you're quite far down. So what I do is I say, put content visibility auto on everything after that. So the majority of the article never gets rendered until someone starts scrolling towards it. And that more than halved layout cost for me on particularly long blog pages.
The only downside is, unless you're careful, you can get weird effects with the scroll bars. The scroll bar grows and shrinks.
If you've got visible scroll bars, the best way to check if that's working is go to the layers panel. And if the document layer is rendered really short, or not really short, but if the document layer is rendered, say, maybe 15,000 pixels tall, then you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, then go back to the layers panel, and it says, oh, it's actually 17,000. That's how you know it worked, because the layers panel is what the browser actually rendered. So try this hack. Go to the layers panel, see how big the document layer is, then go back to your browser, scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, go back to the layers panel, and if that figure has changed from 15,000 to anything else, it means the trick worked. But you're absolutely right. If that number's very different, let's say it rendered 15,000, but then it ended up being 45,000, that scroll bar is going to get a lot shorter.
So two things. So first of all, there's also the content, what's it called? The intrinsic layout height or something, which you can kind of use to
contain
indicate
intrinsic layout.
Yeah. And the other
approximate
thing,
dimensions.
yeah, and the other thing you can do is that when the user scrolls, you can remove the auto, something along these lines, and change it to visible. So there'll be like a jump when they start scrolling, but at least that will only, or at least you can, no, something along these lines. So you're kind of
Because it
deferring
works with
some of the layout work.
Yeah. It's all built on intersection observer anyway, so you could hook into that and say, as we get closer, turn it from auto to visible, or that happens automatically. But you're absolutely right. If you're going to do this, you need contain intrinsic size to say every paragraph is roughly 300 pixels tall. So every key element you put contain intrinsic size 1 pixel by 350 or whatever, and that should minimize the jumping that you're describing.
Yeah. I think we're nearing the end of our show, and we need to move into picks. So, is there anything else you really would like to mention?
Honestly, from me, not much at all. Just INP is the next thing to worry about for most sites that are benchmarking core web vitals. So, if you haven't been taking it seriously already, 12th of March, if you haven't seen the announcement yet, if you don't know where to look for your INP scores, ask your marketing team or your SEO team or whoever's in charge to give you access to Search Console. And go look for core web vitals in there, and that'll tell you where to start looking. And if you need any help with it, you can always get in touch with me. You can tweet at me. I've got some resources around INP. That's the only real pressing thing that's on my mind at the moment. Do you know what? As long as Google invent a new metric every 2 years, I've got a job for life.
Well, the next one, I think that's the next big change that's probably going to land is when they make soft navigations official. So even like in single-page applications, they'll start measuring the navigations between pages that happen on client-side rendered apps. But I don't know what the impact will be. Will it make scores worse or better? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think better. I think sites will it'll be easier to optimize them, and the scores will get better as well. I think that's my prediction.
Time will tell.
All right.
Yeah,
well,
indeed.
I've got a hard stop that was 30 seconds ago. So let's go ahead and wrap up. First of all, Harry, if people want to find you, where should they find you at?
Regrettably, CSS wizardry everywhere. So Mastodon or X or my website or email is cswizardry@gmail. If anyone needs anything, got any questions or wants any of the resources that I've spoken about, you can find me at CSS wizardry everywhere.
All right. Thanks. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up, get to picks. Picks are where we just talk about something that was interesting or that we liked or that's on our mind, that could be tech related or not. I will actually go first this time. So we talked about Image Optim. So I will drop a link to Image Optim. It is, like I said, the best tool, as far as I'm aware, for being able to resize images so that
it's staggeringly effective.
Well, it's brute force effective, so yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does way better than it just takes a long time. You just sit there and you wait. Okay, so there's that. And then of other things, I've been playing around more with Home Assistant. I now have it to the point where there's a sensor downstairs, and I have the path to get it so that the temperature is changing based on the downstairs temperature. The thermostat is turning on or off based on the downstairs temperature rather than the temperature that's in the thermostat itself. I don't have it quite working yet because I basically have to set 4 different events of like, if the temperature goes here, if the temperature goes there, turn on, turn off. If it goes here, if it goes there, turn on, turn off. But I got one of the events set up, so I know I can set up the other ones. And then I just ordered, IKEA has Zigbee stuff. And so I just ordered some of that, and I don't know if I'll get it this week or next or whatever, but they've got some switches and whatnot. The thermostat is Z-Wave. The temperature sensor is Zigbee. I'm using the Home Assistant made Sky Connect for the Zigbee devices, and some, I can't remember what it is that they recommend, but it's on their website, is the one they recommend the Z-Wave devices. And so we'll see where all this goes. It is a pain in the butt to set up, but if you are looking for an alternative to a smart home without all of that data being constantly monitored and stored by Google and Amazon, there's a path. It doesn't seem like it's a pretty one. It seems like it might be a really good market opportunity, because I just don't. IKEA actually has a smart app. I haven't tried it out because I don't really want all of my data going to IKEA either, because I'm sure that they're not even really a tech company per se. So whereas I at least trust that Google spying on me privately, IKEA will just get hacked and all the data will be out there, unless they're
keeping it in some IKEA cupboard, all that data.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, and then I don't recall if I've been talking much about the aquarium stuff that I'm doing, but it's just so fun. It's such a good hobby. So I've got 2 aquariums set up, and I'm going to set up a few more and try some different things, different plants, different fish. I kind of found the fish that I like. One is just referred as autos, and they are bottom feeders. They must have algae in order to survive. So if you don't have algae in your tank, it's actually good to have a little algae in your tank. But if you don't have algae in your tank, you got to put in some fresh vegetables and let them or blanched vegetables and let them eat that. And then the other ones are the neon tetras. They just look so cool. You have to buy, they say at least 6 of them, but I'm going to say probably at least 10 of them, because the schooling behavior that you want to see, what's cool about them other than they look beautiful, is that they swim around together. And if you only have 6 of them, they're not going to do it as much. So you got to get, probably 10 of them. And they say you need like a 10-gallon tank for 6 or a 20-gallon tank for more, but if there's room in the tank, you can put 10 in a 10-gallon tank. It'll be fine. And then I've got a mystery snail and a fancy guppy, and they all are in our main tank. Well, in our main tank, it's not a fancy guppy, it's a betta, but the betta is a mild tempered betta, so it's not attacking the other fish. And the autos are bottom dwellers, and the neon tetras are mid dwellers, and the betta is a top dweller. So they kind of have, like, it's only a 10-gallon tank, but they have enough space that they don't have to get in fights with each other or anything. But it's a really cool hobby. It's I'd recommend it. And it's therapeutic to, it's art. You build the tank. You're not just throwing in some gravel from PetSmart or Petco and then dropping some fish in. You got to select the aqua soil, and you pattern the sand the way you want it. You put a hill, you put some stem plants, you put some other plants. It's just, and then you actually have less upkeep than if you were to go the typical gravel, painted gravel route, because then the right bacteria are in there. It becomes an ecosystem and it all cycles. Although there is a little bit of prep work you have to do to let the tank sit and cycle before you put the fish in, so that the right bacteria are there to help them live. Because if they're not there, then the first fish you put in the tank, if you don't know about that, they'll die. But anyway, like, there's less upkeep once the ecosystem is going. Very, very little feeding that you need to do, very little cleaning that you need to do. Small, you don't change the whole tank, you just do like a 10 or 20% water change now and then. But it's very, it brings joy to my life. So I
tell.
would pick the aquarium hobby. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dan.
So I like my dog. Dogs beat fish any day of the week in my book, but that's not my pick. So my first pick, how can I not pick it? So it's the Apple Vision Pro. I don't have it.
No.
I'm not planning on getting it anytime soon. But from the videos I've seen, it's simultaneously amazing and ridiculous. So I got to to say that it's a brave product, but I'm just not seeing the killer app for it yet, and I'm not. And people, I've seen people like videos of people walking with it on the street, like that's like an invitation to getting beat up, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that would be my first pick. My second pick is we're watching this show on Netflix. It's called Griselda. It's not like a great show, but it's nice. We enjoy it. Like if you're into the Narcos kind of thing, it's interesting. It turns out that she was like a drug kingpin in Miami in the 70s onward, and it's a TV show with Sofia Vergara, who's actually playing pretty good in the lead role, and it's fun. So that would be my second pick. And oh, one more thing that I wanted to pick. So when we discussed recording this episode, one of the things that I initially hoped that we'd get a chance to talk about was caching rules. But since we haven't gotten around to it before we ran out of time, I would like to recommend Harry's talk from the Performance Now conference, the 2023 talk about caching rules, everything. And I had questions I wanted to ask, but I guess I will save them for another day. But in the interim, I highly recommend that talk. And finally, I'm like hoping for peace in the Middle East and Ukraine, and that would be my picks for today. So over to you, Harry. If you've got anything that you'd like to shout out about anything at all.
Yeah, so nothing specific, nothing that is relatable as yours. I'm missing cycling. I do a lot of cycling, but the weather's just been terrible. So that's me. My next thing to focus on outside of tech is getting back on the bike. It's hanging on the wall just there, looking very, very lonely and unused. I was obsessed with caching last year. So sort of summertime onwards, I just got obsessed with caching because I had a client with some real specific cache problems. That was my tech obsession for sort of fall and winter last year. My new obsession is memory management. I've got a client who's trying to debug memory leaks. They don't care about core web vitals. They don't care about load times. Their
Memory
web
leaks in the
application.
browser?
Memory leaks in the browser. It keeps crashing their Android app is a web view, and it just keeps crashing the Android app, and customers are complaining. So I'm now obsessed with the memory panel, which is very underdocumented, and it's fascinating.
Let's talk about it because I'm actually doing similar work. We've got some issues with node-based services, and ultimately you use the same memory panel. You take a memory dump and then you effectively use the same panel. So it's not an easy panel to use. But it's fairly rare that you run into real memory issues with browser applications. We should probably talk about it. Schedule some time after this podcast. I'd really love to hear about some of your insights, and maybe I can also make some suggestions. So maybe we should schedule a conversation about it.
Yeah, I'm new to my performance management journey, but I'm writing a talk called Memory Management for Mere Mortals, where I am the mere mortal. And I just talk about, okay, I had a client who had this. I even told my client, I don't think I'm the right guy for this job. I do very web, like loading performance. I don't do, I'm like, no, we're convinced you're the right person for this job. So I did all the research and I was like, okay, we can do it, and found some really interesting insights. The memory panel hasn't really been changed for nearly 10 years, maybe longer. But that's what I'm obsessed with at the moment. So I might either write a blog post about that, or there's definitely a talk upcoming. Yeah, Dan, if you want to talk about it specifically after this, then yeah, let's jump on a call and we can swap notes.
Probably a good idea. I'll ping you on X.
All right. Well, with all that, thanks for coming on. It's been great to have you, and especially have you and Dan going back and forth and dropping all those knowledge bombs on us. And we hope to see you again.
Yeah, it's been great. I was very privileged to be invited on. I've seen the podcast for years now, and I've finally got an invite, so I'm really grateful.
Yeah.
You're welcome. All right. Well, we'll catch you later. Adios.